Hello, and welcome to the Mystic Feminine Fertility Podcast, a space for heart-centered conversations about menstrual cycles, fertility, and divine feminine energy. My name is Annalise Yagyajoti, and I am your host, your guide here. I am a reproductive health practitioner who specializes in cycle tracking and fertility optimization. This podcast is brought to you by my free online membership, Mystic Cycles Sisterhood, which is a chock-full resource online of PDFs and videos, and there's a Telegram group and so many beautiful things to help you connect to your cycle, connect to other women, and it's all for free. Without further ado, let's jump into today's interview. I'm joined here today with my dear friend, Britny West. Britny is a coach, healer, and writer devoted to helping women with big dreams let go of perfectionism, self-sabotage, and overworking so they can create a beautiful impact with their gifts without burnout. She is also the author of the guided 21-day self-love workbook, You Woke Up Worthy. Beautiful, beautiful. Britny, how you doing?
I'm doing good. So glad to be here.
Glad to have you. And Britny, where are you at in your menstrual cycle?
So we were just talking about this. I have kind of an irregular cycle because I have PCOS. I'm on day 25, which for most people would be the luteal phase, but I end up following the moon more because since I don't have a regular cycle, I find that I can align with that a bit better. So right now the moon is kind of in that first quarter moon. So it's between the follicular phase and the ovulatory. So I'm kind of like on the cusp of those right now. And I definitely feel that. I feel like that's the energy I'm in right now.
What does that energy feel like in your body?
So it's kind of that feeling of like, for example, with being in the follicular phase, I call that phase Maiden, because you're that young woman. I find that when I'm in Maiden, I have a bit more clarity of thinking. It's easier for me to plan and get things done. And so there's been a lot of nagging tasks that I needed to get done. And yesterday I just spent the whole day getting nagging tasks done. And if I was in my luteal, that would not be happening. I
Mm,
would not be able to do that. But it's just more of a clarity of thinking. And then with the mother, the queen, that's the ovulation. She has a very grounded, she likes to nurture and be grounded and kind of be cozy. And there's lots of lovey-dovey kind of energy, connection, wanting to connect and be around people that you care about. So there's a bit more of an outward energy to it, but still it's like a little bit of both. It's like a coziness, but a lovey-dovey, like let me be around, let me nurture, let me take care of people, let me connect. So I kind of feel like I'm definitely in between those right now.
yeah. Well, that sounds like a lovely space to be.
Yeah, I like it. It's good because I'm about to get married, so it's a good time for me to be feeling those good feelings.
Lovey-dovey.
Yes.
You mentioned having irregular cycles, PCOS. How does that impact your relationship with your cycle?
Yeah, so it has definitely made it to where I connect with the moon more because it's a bit more reliable in that sense. I am always excited though when I do bleed. And when I bleed, I actually kind of say, Yay, I always share with my friends and say, Guess what? I'm bleeding. And like really celebrate that because then I kind of get a taste of what it's like to actually feel the cycle very intimately in my own body. So
Mhm.
if I'm bleeding, I already know immediately, okay, I am, I'm having my menstrual cycle. I'm in my crone time. And it's exciting for me to know where I'm actually at in my body. So that excites me. But in terms of like every day to day, um, because my cycle is irregular, I do often go with the moon because it does impact us, similarly to our period. Obviously, our period is happening in our own body, so it's going to be a little bit more pronounced. But I've had to kind of find my own way of still connecting to that cyclical energy, even though my body doesn't always have the normal, typical cycle.
Yeah, it's on a cycle of its own.
Exactly.
Even with the moon, just like the moon pulls on the water of the tides in the ocean, it pulls on our internal waters.
Yeah. And when I bleed, it's often on the full moon. So when I do, which is interesting. So like anytime I do have a bleed, if it's been 60-day cycle or 70 day, or however long it can be sometimes, I do often end up bleeding around the full moon, which is always kind of magical to me.
Mm-hmm. Right now I'm a new moon bleeder, but I've
Mhm.
alternated and switched throughout my life. Um, but yeah, I love bleeding with the moon and cycling in that way and getting that connection. You
Mhm.
mentioned an excitement when you get your bleed, you're talking to your friends about it. Have you always loved your period?
Definitely not. That's definitely something that I developed over the years. So I had my first period when I was 12 years old, and I actually remember crying and saying, I don't want this.
Oh.
And saying, I don't want this. And my mom was like, well, you can't take it back. It's already here. And I remember I actually had a really traumatic first period because I have PCOS and I didn't get diagnosed, unfortunately, until I was much older. But looking back, I can definitely see that I've had it from pretty much from the get-go because my mom thought I had appendicitis. That's how much pain I was in
Yeah.
with my period. And she had to take me to the doctor immediately. And I wasn't able to get on birth control because I was so young at that time. I had to wait till I was 14. So for those few years, I had a very irregular period. I would have it like I've never really had a regular period. It's always been very irregular. And when I was 14, I started taking birth control and they just had me skip my period entirely. So they just, because they were so bad, I was just on birth control continuously. I would skip the sugar pill week and just go to the next one because they didn't want me to have to go through the pain of it. And so for many years, I had no connection really to my period because I didn't have one. And that, um, I didn't really have that connection with my own body. I was a very like neck up type person
Mhm.
living in the mind. It wasn't until I started having autoimmune conditions and learned that I had PCOS and kind of trying to get more into the body that I started to learn about cyclical living. And it really opened my eyes to that connection to our bodies and how, especially as women, we do have that very cyclical way of moving through time. We have like that 29-day cycle. We do often connect with the moon, the month, in a single month, we can almost feel like we're like four different women in one month. And that gave me a lot of validation when I first discovered this way of looking at the cycle and looking at periods, because I was like, wow, it's almost like I realized how beautiful our periods can be and how they can be a source of, and not just our period, but throughout the entire cycle. It's like there's all this wisdom and there's beauty in each part of our cycle. And so once I started to see that, now when I bleed, I'm like, oh, this is my crone time. And I really celebrate that because there's so much beauty and wisdom that can come from that, even though from a societal perspective, we're taught, oh, it's gross, it's annoying, we don't want to deal with this. We've actually been disconnected from how powerful and sacred that time is for us as women. And I'm trying to reconnect to that as much as I can.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a potent and powerful time. And like in my personal story, like learning about the four different phases of the cycle was so life-changing for me. It really was this wake up moment of, I don't know how my body works. I didn't know that there were four different phases. I didn't know that, bleeding could be a good thing, that ovulating was a good thing. I thought it was just, something that we had, something that we did so that one day we could potentially have children. And in my journey, it's like, oh, the cycle is actually about so much more than that.
Absolutely.
And you've been dropping these words like maiden, mother, crone, which leads us right into kind of the meat of what we wanted to talk about today, which is these archetypes of the cycle. And like I mentioned, there's four different phases of the cycle. Each of them has a different energy. There's different things happening hormonally. And what Britny is really an expert on is these archetypical energies of how to embody the energy of this phase. So, Britny, do you want to jump right in with the archetypes, or do you want me to give an overview of the science?
Whatever you think would be beneficial for your listeners. I'm definitely not that I mean, I obviously love science, but I'm not as well versed from the hormone perspective and from like that piece. So if you feel like that would kind of give a really good foundation for that, then I think that could be valuable.
Let's do it. Let's do it. So the cycle starts when estrogen, progesterone, testosterone bottom out, when they get to their lowest levels and the bleed starts. So that first day of full red flow, that is the beginning of the cycle. And that leads us into the menstrual phase, which is the energy of winter. I won't get into the archetypes, but seasonally, that's our inner winter. As the hormones start to rise, because the follicles in the ovary are starting to develop under the influence of FSH from the brain, the follicles grow, they produce estrogen that stimulates cervical mucus production, and it moves us into this energy of inner spring, or the follicular phase. So this growing, building, hormones getting higher, specifically estrogen in that phase. And then when estrogen reaches a peak, it sends a signal back up to the brain. The brain then releases LH, or luteinizing hormone, which triggers ovulation, which is the third phase. Ovulation is like an inner summer. So estrogen is at its highest, testosterone is at its highest. It's normally amplified energy, openness. The egg is being released from the ovary. It may or may not be fertilized. And then we shift into the luteal phase as progesterone starts to be produced. So after the egg is released in ovulation, the corpus luteum in the ovary starts to break down and progesterone starts to be released. Progesterone brings in this energy of like calming, sleepy, but also like let's get things done energy. There's a great book called This Is Your Brain on Birth Control, and she talked about estrogen in the first part of the cycle being this like sex kitten hormone, and then progesterone being like a mom jeans hormone, where it's like we're going to be comfy cozy, but we're also going to like get it done. Which is our
I
luteal
love that.
or our inner autumn. And then once the hormones go back down and you bleed, the cycle begins again.
I love that. Very, very helpful because it's fun to hear you talk about it from that perspective because it does really align with what's happening with the archetypal energy as well. So on that note, I'll kind of follow the same pathway as Annalise just did. So she talked about our inner winter, right? And that's when we're bleeding. And so from an archetype standpoint, we call that our crone time. So if you aren't familiar with the word crone is like that older, wise woman energy. She's been through life. She's in her later years. So she's been through it, right? She has a lot of guidance, a lot of insight, a lot to share with us. But she's also in a period of her life where things are a lot slower. She's not necessarily trying to prove herself or push herself. It really is that part of your life where you're just kind of looking back over your life of what you've created and what's happened. And you're just kind of in a space of resting and just not just resting, but also kind of like processing and digesting the experiences that you've had. And so for me, that really does line up well with the energy that you're in when we're bleeding. And I know we live in a world where we often have to go to work, we have to do things when we're bleeding. In a perfect world, we would just be able to rest that time and just not have to really go out into the world and just kind of cocoon and get all this beautiful time to rest and process. But even if you do still have to work when you're bleeding or you do still have things to do, just knowing that this energy is happening can be really helpful. One, because often when we're on our period, there's this feeling of almost like feeling like a burden or feeling this weirdness, like, this is a pain. This is something I have to deal with. This is an inconvenience. But actually, if you can see your bleed time as, wow, this is a great source of wisdom. Think about that grandmother energy, or like, I don't know if you guys love Pocahontas, but the tree, the grandmother tree, I feel like the crone is kind of that energy. She's that. So like if there's anything in your life that you're feeling unsure about, or you want to kind of, journal, or just kind of see what comes through during this time, because that's a time when you are a bit more in tune with spiritually, you're a bit more in tune with your true self and what you really desire for yourself. And so I find that it's a great time to journal. It's a great time to really go within and see what messages are coming through for you. And if you can see in your mind's eye this old woman, old wise woman crone energy, and see yourself as an older woman, and that you're taking that time to connect with that part of you, then it can be really valuable, and you can get so much out of this time. It's not just about bleeding, but it's about that connection to yourself during the bleed too. So that's the crone. Um, and really honoring the crone is really letting yourself slow down without guilt. And even if you can't fully take days off, just seeing, well, like, how can I honor her? How can I slow down? How can I look, maybe even how you're dressing? Can you dress a bit more comfortable? Can you nurture yourself a bit more? Can you make yourself some cozy food to just kind of nourish yourself during that time? Like, what kind of, you can even like channel your inner old lady. Like, maybe you do some kind of like knitting or reading, or just cozy things, like having tea. Like maybe you have like a special tea. I have a special tea that I drink when I'm bleeding, and or a little tincture that I drink when I'm bleeding. So just things like that that can make it feel special, because it is, right? And seeing that as a valuable thing. So then we have the maiden. So, the maiden, so I didn't say this, but the crone also aligns. So you have the inner winter crone, and then you're bleeding. So it's your menstrual part of your cycle. And then it also aligns with the new moon. So the new moon, so if you don't have a regular cycle like me, you can still connect with this crone energy during the new moon cycle. And I have an app on my phone called the Moon app, so that I can always see where the moon is. So that's kind of helpful if you have a more irregular period, because I want anyone to be listening that I want you to feel empowered to be able to use these archetypes, whether you have a regular cycle or not. Anyone can use this. It's so powerful. Even if you're no longer cycling, you can still follow the moon, which is really fun. So then you have the next part of the cycle, which is the inner spring. It's the waxing moon. The moon is starting to grow. And you have the follicular phase, and it's the maiden. So maiden is like that young, youthful, naive, a little bit energy of a woman. Like she's just starting out in life. She's excited. Everything feels possible. She has energy for her dreams. She's really going for it. She has like all this excitement for what's possible. And in our society, the maiden is what's mostly valued in our world. So most of us don't have a problem with embracing our maiden. In fact, that's what we kind of feel like we have to be her all the time in order to be valued. And so the thing about the maiden is that because that's the time when we have the most energy, or we feel like we're the most quote unquote productive, we can almost kind of burden the maiden by making her, it's almost like she becomes our workhorse, and we're just like piling all this work on her. Like, okay, I'm feeling like I have energy. Let's just make her do all the things. But actually, this part of our cycle, it's not just about getting things done. There's also a playful energy to it, right? Like, think about being a young woman, everything's like in front of you. So we don't want to just pile work on her. We want her to like, this is a great time to be curious and try new things, and just be playful, and, connect with that youthful energy. and remembering that we're not only valuable during this time, that every part of the cycle has value. And so we don't want to overvalue any part of our cycle. They're all important. But in our society, we're taught that we just need to be like a maiden all the time. We just need to have all the energy, not even just from internal, but from the outside, right? We feel like we have to look young, we have to seem young, and then we're valuable. And so what that can look like in everyday life is that with the maiden, because we feel this pressure to be the maiden all the time, we can feel like that's where that good girl archetype can kind of come in of like, if I can just be perfect, if I can just do enough, be beautiful while I'm at it, be young, be full of energy, then I'll be valuable, then I'll be enough, then I'll be loved. But actually, every archetype and every part of our cycle is so important, and they're all important in their own way, and they're equally important, right? There's not like a hierarchy. So, but we're not taught that in society. We're taught like, oh, we're taught to be afraid of getting older, that we almost don't want that to happen. So the maiden is beautiful, it is important, but it's not the only part of us. And it's not the epitome of success either to be in maiden all the time. So that is our follicular phase. And that is the time, like I said, we have the most energy. But then we start moving into our ovulation time, right? So that's kind of more aligned with the full moon. So think about like everything's kind of at its peak, it's at its fullness. Um, it's a time where as that mother, so I use queen and mother because some people, if you're not a mother, sometimes that could be a little triggering to hear that mother archetype. You're like, well, I'm not a mother. How does that impact me? But that mother archetype is also that queen archetype. And I also think that's very empowering because we often think about mothers, we think about it being kind of like a martyr, but she's actually more like a queen when she's unburdened, when she's really honored
Get a
in her
queen.
energy. A queen, right? She's looking out at her queendom. She's looking out for her people. She's making difficult decisions, but she feels empowered. She feels strong. She feels like her opinions matter. And she's not coming from a place of complete selfishness or selflessness. It's like this beautiful balance of both. She knows what's best, and she uses her wisdom and her own sense of empowerment to make those beautiful decisions for the people around her. So it's a really beautiful way to look at motherhood, I think, as well, because we're often seeing it as like you have to just empty yourself, and then that's what makes you a quote unquote good mother. But actually, being more of this queen archetype, it's about being that loving, nurturing person, but also coming from that space of true connection and feeling enough, like a full moon, like she's at her fullest. You can see her in the sky. She's gorgeous, right? And that's what I feel like when we're in our fullness, that's how we are. We're very magnetic. So I know when when I do ovulate, I definitely feel that magnetism. Like you can feel it the way that you dress, maybe that's a time that you want to wear your red lipstick. You just feel kind of like a sex kitten. You feel like, ooh, like you're flirting with life. Like you just feel magnetic and beautiful. Um, and maybe you get a bit more frisky. I know I definitely get more frisky when I'm ovulating. So there's definitely this like very magnetic force around this time, and it's a wonderful time. So like looking at it from a space of like being out in the world, like this is a great time when you're ovulating or you're in the full moon to be out in the world or to do interviews or to connect with people, to hang out with people, because that's when you're going to be really wanting to do those things. It's going to be something that you're going to want to do, is to actually be out a little bit more in the world. So that does often come up. It's a time to celebrate too. Celebrate what you've already, because maiden, you probably got a lot done. So like honoring and celebrating that and taking the time to really take all that in and be like, wow, look what we've built already. Look what we've made. Um, and then the last part of the cycle is that inner autumn. That's the luteal phase. And she is the wild woman archetype. which wild woman is the archetype that I had to do the most healing around, and most women do, because I mentioned earlier that Maiden is the most valued archetype, whereas wild woman is the most reviled archetype in our society. So wild woman is, so even just thinking about how we talk about when women are PMSing, right? We're like, oh, they're being bitchy, she's PMSing. Um, so even as women, we can often feel like we're a burden during that time, or no one wants to really deal with that. We might not even want to deal with it. But it's actually a very valuable part of our cycle, because basically the wild woman is the part of us that is saying enough's enough. This is not working anymore. So she has this clarity of like what's actually working and what's not. And so it's not necessarily a time that you go and run and make those decisions right then, because your emotions are probably really high. But it is a great time to just be aware of your emotions and say, oh, I'm finding that this is really triggering me this cycle, or this is really bothering me. Write that down, because there's probably some truth in that. It might feel a bit more elevated during that time than normal, but it's almost like it's being elevated for a reason, so you can see it. Because if you just push that part of you down that's frustrated, that's annoyed, it could be boundaries that are coming up that you're like, all of a sudden you're like, I can't deal with this. I can't deal with my boundaries being pushed around this issue anymore. And the wild woman is like, I always vision the wild woman as like that primal part of us. Like um she's like around a fire, and she's just like, her hair's wild, and she's just like, she is the most wild, uncaged, primal version of ourselves. And she wants what she wants, and she knows what she truly desires, and she's not afraid to say it. She's not afraid to ask for what she wants. She has, I feel like the reason in some ways our cravings are high during this time, right? It's like, it's a symbol not only from a food perspective, but from our heart. It's like we have things that we crave. And so sometimes you can ask, aside from chocolate and cake, if you're like me, it's like, what am I? Okay, my body is craving these things, but what is my soul craving? What is my wild woman craving in my life right now? And I like to like really connect with her and even ask, like, what am I no longer willing to tolerate? What is like no longer tolerable? And what do I want to not bring with me into this next cycle? And so I've learned so much from that part of me, because she's kind of the antithesis of the good girl. Or there's the good girl is like, let me do what everyone else wants. Let me be who I think they want me to be. The wild woman is like, what about our authenticity? What about who we really are? Who is she? And she wants to be revealed. Um, and that's scary for us often, because we're like, oh my gosh, if I reveal this part of me, what are people going to think? That's so scary. But she's also like that most alive, juicy, authentic part of us. And so there's a lot of beauty there. Um, I love the wild woman. I love all of them. But I think, like I said, the reason I focus a lot on the wild woman in my own work is because she's the part that needs the most healing. Her and Crone, I feel like, are the ones that need the most healing in our society, because Maiden and Mother are they are valued. Now, Mother's valued in kind of a toxic way in our society, which is why I was like, let's talk about the queen energy, because that's really what that is. But Maiden and Mother don't have as much stress or resistance around accepting. But the Crone and the wild woman, those are the parts of our cycle that we feel like aren't valued, aren't important, are kind of a pain in the ass, if we're really honest. But if we can shift that and look at it as, wow, this is actually a sacred time, that's when I feel like everything else starts to flow better, because you can bring that. We need our maiden needs the wisdom of the crone, right? And we need that insight of, okay, next time, what do I want to do differently? And that's where the wild woman really shines too. She's like, this is what I really desire. Because if the maiden has all this energy, but she's using all her energy for something that's not even true for her or what she really wants. Is that even really productive? But if she gets that wisdom from the wild woman and she's like, wow, I learned from my wild woman that we really desire this, we're really craving this in our life, then she can use that energy for good for herself in a way that's actually going to like bring your life to more fullness and more aliveness. So, it's something that happens over time. I've been working with these energies for now about 6 years, and I still feel like I'm very much at the beginning of understanding it. Um, I would say if you've never worked with these energies before, I think it starts with just noticing that part of you. So like when you're in that cycle, just even saying, "Oh, I'm in Maiden," or "Oh, I'm in Crone," just using the words and looking at the energy of it can be really helpful just to again, be so much more gentle with yourself. You're like, oh, it's okay for me to be feeling this way because that actually makes sense. That actually aligns with this part of my cycle. And so there can be a lot of healing just in that, just in naming where you're at and realizing that you don't have to be the same woman every single day. And it's kind of not possible because of the way that our hormones and our bodies work. So I think for me, it started with just a lot of acceptance and love of myself and being able to just not be so hard on myself. And then it just gets deeper and deeper as you keep doing that work and spending more time with each of these energies. And we're all different, right? So your experience of Maiden is going to be very different from mine. We all have our own little flavors of it, but it's been such a life-changing thing for me to build that connection.
Oh my gosh, I love this so much. And I love hearing you speak on it and bring your little individual spice to it and all the things that you've learned and the women that you've worked with in your one-on-one work and your work with yourself. There's so much potency here in this. And I completely agree. Like the wild woman and the crone, the luteal phase and the bleed are the most rejected in society. The fact that we still feel the need to hide when we're menstruating and pretend like it's not happening. And then all the things that happen in the luteal phase that fall under the umbrella of PMS. I've gone into depth about the luteal phase, about PMS. There's a great episode that I did earlier on called Depth in the Darkness with Amanda Lee. And she used the term luteal longing. Like, what
Ooh.
is your luteal phase showing you that you're longing? And you brought up such a beautiful point of like, feel it, acknowledge it, maybe don't act on it just yet. In my life, I have a practice of bleeding on it. So
Oh, I love that phrase. Yes, I love it.
I think it came from Lisa Lister. Um, as much as I'd love to say that I made it up, Lisa Lister, who wrote the book Code Red. Have you read that one?
I haven't read that one.
So it was like an early introduction to the four phases of the cycle for me. And you would love her. I'm going to send you her stuff. But yeah, it gave me this concept of like, I'm going to feel my feelings in the luteal phase. I'm going to feel this intensity, but I'm not going to act on it yet. I'm going to wait until I'm bleeding when I have the clarity, when I have the groundedness, that downward moving energy. In yoga, we call it apan pran, but it grounds us down when the menstrual blood is actually flowing. The energy field is a little bit thinner, and we have more access to our psychic abilities and intuition, and we can better make these larger decisions. The example that I use is that, and it doesn't happen so much anymore, but for the first like 4 years, after like COVID started and when I was no longer living nomadically, when I was based in the States, every luteal phase, I would get this incredible urge to like implode my life and get on a plane and leave the country. Every luteal phase. And it's funny because like if you're not writing it down or paying attention to it, it feels random.
Yeah.
But when you actually, write it down, pay attention, when you understand your cycles and your phases, you're like, oh, this is actually happening every cycle at this part. And so I'd say, you know what? If I bleed and I still feel this desire to, break up with my boyfriend, buy a plane ticket and get out of here, I'll do it. And that was the agreement that I made with myself. And it
Mhm.
never happened. Like I still traveled. But when I
Surprise. No.
said I felt that level of intensity, and I was like, I need to leave still. Because what my luteal phase was showing me was this deep desire for adventure, for travel, a need and desire that can be integrated into my life without the full on destruction energy that the wild woman can bring of like, do it all, do it now. But I could
Mhm.
still honor her by listening to her, by acknowledging what she wants, by getting curious and honoring the wisdom that is in my body, in my psyche. Because these archetypes, they just give us insight into different parts of our being, into our psyche, these different characters that we can put energy into and relate to. So I think that's so helpful and so important to say, yeah, like the bleeding phase, the luteal phase, they are not the ones that the world is like, yay. The world wants us in our maiden and in our mother. And in that, like you were saying, the unhealthy, um, or not unhealthy, I don't mean to be judgmental, but the self-sacrificing mother.
Yeah, the burdened mother. Yeah.
Burden
And we
mother.
can have a burdened maiden too. We often do have a burdened maiden, which, like I said, is our good girl archetype shining out. And then I think the burdened mother is the martyr.
Yeah.
There's shadow sides to all of these archetypes when
Mm-hmm.
they're not honored and
Mm-hmm.
when they're used in a way that they really weren't intended for, or they're used for outside instead of being used in a way that's healthy for ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's shadow sides to all these archetypes. And as we're working with them. Really, I mean, it's a tool for self healing, self inquiry. They aren't hard and fast rules by any means. Like there are some cycles where I'm like, technically, I'm in my luteal phase, but I feel more like the maiden. And a lot of that can have to do with when your body is in one cycle and the moon is in a cycle, and all of the things
Yes.
but one of the things that I'm curious about that you brought up is when you have these longer cycles. So you were mentioning that you have PCOS, and part of the makeup of your PCOS is these longer cycles. The medical definition of an irregular cycle is one that is consistently longer than 35 days. And from knowing you, I know that that is the case. Like you are having these long cycles. And when people have long cycles, it doesn't mean that you ovulate on day 14 and then you're waiting for your bleed. It means that your ovulation isn't happening until much later in the cycle. The luteal phase is fixed. It can only be, 10 to 14 days without a pregnancy. But the follicular phase, so the spring, that's the variability. So when someone is having these longer cycles consistently, does that mean, and I'm curious if this is anything that relates, that you spend more time in the maiden archetype?
I love that question. And now, of course, everyone's different. So I'm not going to like speak for every person with a long cycle. But for me, I think that's why I've developed such a relationship with the moon because it enables me to still have the experience of the four different, because this is how I look at it with the seasons. It's like Russian dolls, right? So we have, imagine if you, when I say Russian dolls, it's the babushka dolls, right? That you
The
open
stack.
up and there's a little one inside it, and then there's another one inside it until you get this little bitty doll in the very, very center. And so I like to look at cyclical living in the same way because we actually have phases of our lives. So we can be in the maiden phase of our life, and that's the biggest Russian doll, right? Or we can be in the crone phase of our life, depending on what age we are, right? So I'm right now in my queen mother phase of my life. So that does every layer does impact you. Obviously, the bigger the doll, the less it's going to touch the little doll on the inside, but it's still there, right? The energy is still there. And so then the next doll would be the seasons, right? The actual season in nature that we're experiencing. So right now we're in fall, right? So we're going to feel the energy of fall around us, what we want to eat, how we dress, like how we feel, the things that we feel drawn to do. We're going to be very impacted by the season that we're in nature. Then, of course, we have the moon cycle, right? That impacts us. And then we have, if we're still bleeding, our menstrual cycle, which is like the smallest, most internal, quote unquote, Russian doll, if we're using this analogy. And so I look at it as like, so it's all these energies do impact us all at the same time. So that's why the flavors can be different. It's like, you can be in the Crone season of your, or I guess you wouldn't be in the Crone season because wouldn't be bleeding anymore. Let's say let's say that you're in the mother phase of your life, and it's also a full moon but you're bleeding. So even though you're bleeding and that's a Crone time, it's summer, right? And you're in a season of your life where maybe you have a bit more energy. So how you feel during that time, with it being summertime and you're bleeding, it's maybe going to feel different than if you're bleeding in the winter time. Like those bleeds are going to feel slightly different. So because of how we have these different layers impacting us, it kind of, it's not linear, right? None of this is linear. It's deeper than that. We like to look at everything as like, oh, well, I'm in this step, but the cycles don't work like that. We're not like, okay, well, this is all it's impacting me. No, we still have all these different influences. And so if I like to actually write down all four, or more mainly, I mean, obviously you're going to stay in one phase of your life for a long time, but I look at the moon phase, the season we're in, and then what's going on in my own body. And I find that looking at all three helps me to kind of understand what my body is craving, what my body needs. Um, and since I can't always connect with my own menstrual cycle, even just having those two outer ones, like the season I'm in, like fall, and then where the moon is, I can get a lot of information, even just from those two layers. Like I said, it's magical when I have all three, and I love that. It's exciting for me, and I celebrate it. But you get to have this experience regardless. So I definitely think that you get to have it.
Beautiful. And yeah, I think that's a wonderful reminder of like all these things are happening at the same time. And in the beginning, it can be helpful. Like if you're new to this information and you're like, what? To take the time.
Yeah, I don't want to overwhelm people, but
yeah. I mean, people are tuning in at all different parts of their journey. So there's some people that already knew the archetypes and are now putting together the different pieces. And then there's some people that are going to be brand new. And so I'd say probably start with one, track your cycle. What season is it? You add on, what archetype is it? Where's the moon? How is that impacting it? Like you add on slowly, but you can start with just one or two. Like all of these archetypes are meant to be helpful, supportive, and just understanding yourself and integrating the different parts of yourself and providing space that all parts of yourself, each phase, each archetype, each season is needed, it's a part of the cycle. Like we can't just show up in our ovulation summer happy-go-lucky full moon energy. I don't know, full moons are chaotic. So our summer external energy all the time, even though that's kind of what society wants us to do. Like really, we do have to go through these cycles of the wild woman and the crone. And the more that you ignore them, they don't want to be ignored. And they will not be ignored. You will start to notice symptoms in your body, in your cycle, in your life, if you are not able to embrace the different parts of yourself, the darkness and the light.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. And I'm a very visual person. So if anyone's listening to all this and it's really hard to follow because you need like a visual guide, I actually have a handout that I can give Annalise that if you want to put it as a link, like maybe I think it's on Canvas, maybe I can link it that way or something, or a PDF. But I do find it so much simpler to actually have something to look at visually, and it will have all these different layers for you so you can see it visually. And I think that actually helps it to really click for most people if they can just see the visual of how all these things work together.
Yes, let's definitely include that. And I'm curious, Britny, how does the archetypical work, cycle work, show up in your work with women?
Yeah. So I feel like because we do have we have these 4 archetypes that we're cycling through every month, that you mentioned this a little bit when you said that if we ignore those parts of ourselves, it can kind of wreak havoc in our life. But often the women that come to me, they are trying to live in Maiden. So they're trying to prove their worth through what they're doing. They're burning themselves out because they are trying to be in perpetual spring all the time. And our bodies are not made to do that. And so they're exhausted, they're burned out, and they're frustrated and resentful as well because they put all this effort and all this energy and they're not feeling like they're getting a return on that energy. Um, and they often also feel just kind of burned by other people because they don't have boundaries. They've, just constantly been doing and trying to prove themselves and be helpful to everyone, but just kind of ignoring their own needs and their own selves in that process, that they kind of hit a breaking point eventually, right? Where they're like, enough's enough. We can't keep going like this. And so what I find in this work is that it's almost like I'm having to reintroduce or sometimes introduce for the first time um, themselves to those other aspects of themselves, like their wild woman, especially, and then also the crone energy. The wild woman, I do spend a lot of energy helping women with connecting to their wild woman because that's where their creativity, their dreams, their desires, their longings, their authenticity, their wildness, like the part of them that they've repressed and pushed down for so long. It's like they're getting to know who they really are for the first time. And it's really powerful. And it's kind of the only way to start to heal that good girl archetype and that martyr archetype is to reconnect with that part of yourself because she gives you courage, right? She gives you strength to be able to say, no, I don't want to do that anymore, or I do need to set boundaries. If you don't connect with that part of yourself, it's hard to have the courage to do those things. And if we can connect to that inner wild woman part of us and say, yeah, I am capable, I am strong, I can be a force to be reckoned with, right? If I really want to be, then we have that ability to like come back to authenticity in a way that we couldn't when we were just staying like this perpetual young naive woman or this burdened mother, like I have to give everything or else I'm not enough. And it's very healing for a lot of people because even most of my clients I've worked with are actually in their 40s, some are in their 50s. And so they've lived their whole lives being everything to everyone else. And now they're finally realizing, oh my gosh, I get to have something for myself now. I get to be who I really want to be. So it's really beautiful to witness that for people and help them through that.
Mm, I love that. And what are you offering out in the world? How can people connect with you? Who are you calling in?
Yeah, so right now I'm actually kind of in a crone period of my own. So I also like to call the crone our fertile void.
Mm,
It's not my term. I can't remember where I got that from, but fertile void, right? So you think about like a crop or a field that's laying fallow. So even though there's nothing growing, there's all these the soil needs to rest, right? In order for it to be good for the next season when we plant again. And so the fertile void, when we are bleeding or when we're taking a time, we can have a winter season, right, of our lives where we don't really know what's next. I'm kind of in a space where I'm kind of figuring out what my next phase is. And it's very exciting because for the first time in my life, I'm really fully embracing however long this needs to take to be in this winter. And so what that means is that I don't really have anything I'm offering at the moment because I'm calling it my healing cocoon. I'm figuring out what does my wild one really long for right now? And it's been really fun. It's been like this, because I'm not putting pressure on it. I'm just letting it be what it is. And I'm discovering so many things about myself, things I didn't even realize that I wanted to do have started to pop up. Things that I think have maybe been behind it's almost been like kind of pushed down, and I never even knew it was there because I never really gave it the time to rise up. And so, yeah, all this sounds very vague, but it's a really beautiful time in my life right now just to let myself figure out what I want. I've always been the type of person that just rushes and says, okay, let's figure this out. Let's go. Again, that maiden showing up,
Mm.
having always had to have a plan, always had to have that next step. Or, when you're celebrating and people say, okay, what's next? Like I've been that person that already knew what was next at all times. And so there's a certain surrender that's happening for me right now. I'm saying, you know what? I don't know what's next. And that's okay. But it's really exciting for me. So yeah, at the moment, I have my Instagram account. I'm not really posting a lot right there right now, business wise, but I am Britny Nicole. And but I will say I'll give a little bit of a hint that what I'm wanting to do is something related to helping mothers, but also helping their children. So that's kind of some things that I'm working on right now. And I'm excited when I do finally unveil it, how that's going to go for me. But this work has definitely got me to where I'm at today. It has helped me heal so much. I had a really challenging childhood. I had a lot of childhood trauma. And so I will say that this cyclical living work, it's so much deeper than just, oh, I'm bleeding. It
Mm.
can heal your entire life if you just take the time to really connect to yourself and learn from these different wise women that live inside you, because they are you, right? So if anyone's listening to this and you're like, I don't know about this, I just really encourage you, if you feel any kind of pull towards it, yeah, go deeper. There's two books I would recommend, and I'll give these to Annalise to share with you guys, but there's one that's called Women Who Run with the Wolves by Clarissa Pinkola Estés. And then there's Wild Power. And I can't remember the authors of those, but Wild
Alexandria
Power
Pope.
is a really good book too for this, if you're curious and you want to go deeper.
Mm-hmm. I have that one on my bookshelf. It's Alexandria.
Oh, Wild Power. Yeah, that's
Mhm.
good.
It's a good one. Beautiful, my dear. Well, is there anything else that you want to share today? Anything that you feel needs to be said?
No, I feel really complete. I know that I shared a lot, so I have a lot to share on this topic, so I hope I didn't inundate you guys too much. But I do hope that you can take at least one, if you take one thing from this entire conversation, I think the most valuable thing is realizing that you do have these four different energies that you're flowing through, and there's nothing wrong with that. And in fact, there's so much value in it. And like I said, if you just start there, just starting with accepting that there's beauty in all four of these energies and that you don't have to stay in one and that one's not more valuable than the other, I think that is such a big step, just that on its own.
It's huge. Oh, okay. Thank you so much, Britny. I appreciate you being here. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of the Mystic Feminine Fertility Podcast. And if you want to learn more about cycle tracking, divine feminine energy, and connecting to the goddess within, you're very welcome to visit mysticfemininefertility.com or check me out on Instagram or TikTok. Have a beautiful rest of your day. Thank you so much for spending time with me.